Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wind Down Wednesdays. I'm your host, Paula Taylor, and this is episode 159. So today we're going to talk about endurance versus pleasure. And we've got a couple of long-running themes on the show, or things that I have called series. We do some series shows. And so one of those is trauma healing, and the other one is spiritual awakening. And this falls into both categories. This is a yes and. This is about trauma healing, and this is about spiritual awakening, this topic of endurance versus pleasure. And if you've watched any of the recent shows or listened to them, I've been talking about pleasure quite a bit this year. I had a moment a few months ago or earlier this year when I was receiving this massage in Mexico, and I had this kind of message come through. What if life is really all about finding pleasure? And so that's been kind of in the back of my mind throughout this year. And then I got this unexpected opportunity at kind of the last minute to go to this retreat in Bali. It was amazing. I was able to present dimensional frequency expansion in this amazing yoga shala, open door, open to the outdoors, or outdoors, open air. That's the word. It's the phrase I was looking for. Receive lots of interesting and amazing kind of healings and insights. But I want to talk about this, what kind of came through as a theme of this trip for me personally, which is this idea of endurance versus pleasure. So I'm going to tell you this story of kind of how this came into my awareness, and then how I used it throughout this trip, and how it applies to both trauma healing and spiritual awakening, which are very closely related. Our healing journey is not a straight line. And so there are aspects of trauma healing to be found in spiritual awakening and vice versa. And I did a whole show where I talked about how does trauma healing lead to spiritual awakening. So I got to Bali, and then I had about a day to kind of get my bearings, which was amazing. And then the first full day of the retreat ended up being like about a 15-hour day. We were doing this excursion. The traffic is beyond belief there. It is, if you've never experienced traffic in Southeast Asia, it's hard to even describe, but you feel like you're taking your life into your hands when you walk down the street as well as when you're riding down the street. And we heard so many stories of people. A lot of people get around on scooters because they can kind of weave in and out of the larger vehicles. And pretty much everybody we spoke to had been in a fairly serious scooter accident. So sometimes you hear stories and then you think, oh, well, they've got this system down, they've got it figured out, but injury happens. It's a real thing. And I was grateful to be riding not on a scooter for sure. So we took this excursion and I looked at my maps. It was about a 55-mile round trip, but the driving time, we went to a few different places. It was about an hour and a half to the first place, and then just maybe about 20-30 minutes to the next place, another like 30-40 minutes to the final place, and then a good hour and a half probably home. So a lot of time in the van. And just a really long day, especially considering a lot of us had sort of just arrived, and it just kind of worked out that way. It was a day of endurance and pleasure. So let me get into my story, and then I'll kind of explain where this whole topic came from. So the first stop we were making that day was to go to a water temple. And I will tell you, and this is pretty common for me, like when I commit to something, when I commit to a healing journey, I am all in. And so I woke up that day already kind of having a lot of emotional release, having some things come up in my personal life that I felt like I wanted to let go of, that I wanted to move on from, some grief. There were some things coming up, and I was feeling a little bit emotional that morning. And the night before, I had been awake for part of the night and sort of received this message not to participate in this water temple, in this purification ritual, and which was kind of disappointing to me. It was one of the things I was really looking forward to. And so I went into this kind of like with an open mind. I was like, well, I did receive this messaging. I'm not sure about this, but I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to go into this and just kind of try to trust my intuition or if I'm getting any messages. And there were some people who were not participating in this, not necessarily by choice, just because of the way that the ritual works over there. There were some people who were not invited into the temple. Menstruating women are not invited into the temple. So there were some people that were having to sit this water purification ritual out. But I decided I was going to try it. And the first thing I'll say, so we got in this van. It was other than coming from the airport, it was my first real experience of this traffic. And at that point, I had been awake for like 30 hours and was barely cognizant. So this was my first real experience. I do get motion sick. And so I had taken medication, but I was not feeling great on this trip. I was feeling a little bit like uneasy, I will say. And there were a few other people having issues too, and that's another one of my triggers, is just fear of other people being sick. So I was already a little bit triggered on this van ride just by the intensity of the ride itself, and then by kind of not feeling great. The other thing is, if you've ever been to this part of the world, I cannot adequately with words describe the heat here. The humidity. So I live in a hot place, but it's a desert, and people always say, oh, it's a dry heat. And there's kind of a joke about that because heat is heat. But humid heat is something else. And I've been to other humid climates before, but nothing like this. And so the heat was incredible. It is, I would describe the word oppressive. And luckily, in my opinion, we had clouds for a lot of the trip and some rain at the beginning, which felt very cleansing because it was so hot. So you're coming off a long journey, you're trying to adjust. It was 15 hours later there than it is here in Tucson. And then we got in this car. So I will tell you that I was already in somewhat of a triggered state when we arrived at this place. My trauma triggering was, my nervous system was not feeling very regulated. It wasn't completely dysregulated, and I was doing practices to try to bring myself back to calm, things that we talk about like thymus rubs or thymus taps, deep breathing, things like that. So we got to the temple, and I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and do this, or I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to go in and see what happens. And so we went down as a group, and it was very crowded. There were a lot of people approaching us, trying to sell us things. There were a lot of local people there because had been an event locally that was bringing people more to the temples. And the further down, we kind of went down a bunch of stairs. It was so beautiful. It was so amazing. I did take some pictures on the way back up, but maybe I'll post that as a reel tomorrow just so you can see visuals of what I'm talking about. But I didn't realize how many steps we went down until I went back up them later. And it was a lot of steps. It was maybe 100 steps or so, kind of split up into levels. So you kind of descended a level, and we had a tour guide, and he was like trying to tell us what was happening, but it was very chaotic. And that's another one of my triggers, is crowds and the noise and the closeness and the chaos of crowds. There were just a lot of people there. There were a few other tourists there. There were a lot of local people there. It was a very chaotic environment. So he was trying to kind of give us some information as we went down, but there were women who needed to use the bathroom. There wasn't really a bathroom. It was just very chaotic feeling. So we were descending down, and we finally get all the way down to where the actual temple is. It's really beautiful. And again, I'll post some pictures of this and maybe link them in the podcast notes. So the way the ritual is, the other thing is you need to be covered. There's rules about having your legs covered. So we all had a sarong tied around us, and then you had to go from a dry sarong to a wet sarong to get into the temple. And then as you came out, you were supposed to change back to the dry sarong, kind of give the wet sarong back. So there was quite a few steps involved in this process. But the actual purification ritual, it looked very beautiful. There's water. These are fresh springs. There's water coming out. The women who did it were directed to, you kind of approach the water in a certain way. You bring it to your lips. You kind of splash yourself with it. And then afterwards they went into a little kind of an open air temple where they were blessed and had, I think it was rice placed on their foreheads. I've already given away that I didn't end up doing this, but that's okay. Let's go through the story. So the further down into this we got, the more triggered I started getting, and I was trying to endure. I was trying to just kind of muscle through it. I thought, I just, if I can just get into the water, I think I'll be okay. But there was a very small area with lockers where you were meant to lock your things up, and it was completely packed with people. There were a few changing areas. It was very wet. It was very smelly and kind of moldy. And it honestly smelled like people were just kind of peeing on the floor, which there was not really bathrooms accessible. So it's possible that was actually happening. And so we got crammed into this corner where we were supposed to be getting a locker key and then putting our stuff in and then taking our dry sarong off. We were all in our bathing suits already. But it was very chaotic. It was very crowded, and I just got really triggered. My nervous system was getting more and more and more dysregulated. I wasn't breathing deeply. My heart was starting to race. I was starting to essentially I ended up having a full-on panic attack. And I kept trying to push myself to do this because I felt like, again, if I could just get out of this crowded area and into the water, like, it would have been okay. I could have come out of endurance and into pleasure, but I just couldn't get there. I got more and more and more triggered. I was trying to put my stuff away. I opened one of the doors to the dressing room. It was like incredibly unclean, and I just lost it. And I was like, I have to get out of here. And the women were so gracious and amazing, and they helped me kind of get my sarong back on because I was like about to just bolt out in my bathing suit, and which had shorts, but you're supposed to have your legs, your knees covered. And so they helped me kind of get the sarong tied, and essentially just ran out of this temple, but not really, because as I realized trying to get out of here in this like completely panic triggered state, there was like about 100 stairs to go up. It was about 100 degrees, the feel with the humidity. And I was carrying this huge backpack of stuff because we were going to be gone for the whole day. So I had like a change of clothes, and I had a poncho, and I had some snacks, and I had water. So it just, again, I got completely dysregulated. I got completely trauma triggered. And I was stopping and taking pictures as I like hyperventilated and like ran my way back out, and I had to keep stopping and trying to breathe, and it was just not pleasant. It was all endurance. There was no pleasure in this part of the day for sure. And I got back to the van, and I was like crying and hyperventilating and completely, extremely overheated. And the women were so amazing. There were 3 other women. And that's the other thing. There was nowhere to wait. There was nowhere that was cool. So they were basically just sitting in this hot van waiting for everybody to finish so that we could go on to the next space. They were like fanning me, offering me water, kind of letting me kind of cry and sort of talk through what had happened and the feelings that I had that were coming up. And we had an amazing time. I called it the Sweat Lodge because it was so hot in the van, but we really connected deeply, and it turned out, I think that was where I was meant to be, rather than in this purification ritual, which again looked really beautiful and amazing. And the women who participated really felt something with it, but I just wasn't able to do it. I was not able to endure. And so after that, we went to this amazing restaurant that is open air and backs up to this like terraced rice paddies, and it had this beautiful swing. And if you've been watching my social media, I've posted this picture of myself on the swing a few times. And so we got there. I was extremely overheated. My ankles were swollen from traveling. I didn't realize that length of traveling can do that. Everybody in our party was kind of having issues on and off with swelling. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I was still really dysregulated and overheated. And so at first, when people were like, oh, we're going to go on this swing, we're going to get in line to get on this swing. And I was like, nope, I'm out. I also don't do heights. And that was like my first response. But as I sat and I got myself re-regulated, I got some fluids in me. I cooled off. I went down. There was a pool. I put my feet in the pool to kind of try to cool myself off. I watched these other women on the swing just looking like they were having an amazing time. We got some food, we got some drinks, and as I was able to re-regulate myself, that's part of trauma healing, is learning how to take care of yourself so that you can come out of, because we're always going to get dysregulated. There are going to be things that dysregulate us. And when we are sensitive, when we have a history of trauma, when we are neurodivergent, which came up for me a lot on this trip, we will get triggered. Everybody will get triggered. But when we have complex histories and neurodivergence, sometimes we get triggered more often. And so the goal of the journey, the spiritual awakening part of the journey, is not that you never get triggered. It's that you learn how to come out of it. You learn how to quickly re-regulate yourself and release anything so that you're not carrying new traumas with you as you move forward. So as I said, I got re-regulated, and I started, this is when this idea started percolating of endurance versus pleasure versus endurance. So that first part of the day, it was all endurance for me. That's not true, actually. The first part of the day leading up to when I got back to the van was all endurance. And there was still endurance in the van because it was very hot and it was kind of a long wait. But there was a lot of pleasure that I found having this heart-to-heart circle with these other women. We got really deep. We really talked a lot about grief. We shared some really intimate details about ourselves. And so there was a huge amount of pleasure in that. And pleasure is something that can help us start to re-regulate. So as I was sitting in this restaurant or outside at this restaurant and kind of watching the people swing and getting myself re-regulated, it came to me that I actually really wanted to get on the swing. As I looked, it looks really high because the restaurant was seated up kind of at the top of this sort of, it's not really a cliff, but like a drop essentially. And you swing out sort of over the drop. But the swing itself was maybe, I don't know, swing height. And then, you know, as you swung out, it wasn't as high as it maybe looked, or it didn't seem high enough that I wouldn't find pleasure in it. This is when this started coming up. It's like, is this endurance? Is this pleasure? Is this endurance? Is this pleasure? This morning felt like mostly endurance. Am I going to turn this whole day into something that's all endurance, that's all just survival? Am I going to allow myself to be dysregulated through this entire experience? Or am I going to take care of myself, come back into regulation the best that I can, and then make decisions from a regulated space about what is really pleasure for me, what is endurance, what is pleasure. And I'm like, I'm going to get on that swing. And it was very interesting. It was a huge shift for me because it didn't feel like, at first it was like I could have gone and just been like, I'm going to prove to myself that I can do this. I'm going to get on the swing. I could have done the same thing at the water purification ritual. I could have been like, I'm just going to muscle through this. I'm going to do it. I'm going to ignore my body and all the signs that are telling me not to do this. I'm just going to do it anyway. And so when I got to the swing, it was like, wait a minute, this could actually be pleasurable for me. There's a little bit of fear involved, but if I put aside all of the triggering that happened to me earlier today, if I come back to myself and I look at this opportunity with fresh eyes, not bringing any baggage into it, this is something that I want to do. And so I decided to do it, and they had these beautiful dresses and skirts that people were wearing that looked awesome as you swung out, and the skirt kind of trails behind you. And it felt really important to me to just go as I was. I was still in my bathing suit, my shorts and my bathing suit top. And I was like, the guy said, oh, aren't you going to get a dress? And I said, nope, just me. And he said, oh, why not? And I didn't want to go into this long story of how it felt really important to me that it was just me, that there was no pretense, just me on the swing. And I'm not saying that anyone else who put the dress on, that this was for me personally. It felt like I just wanted it to be me, just me and the swing and the experience. And I didn't care so much about how I looked doing it or what the pictures would look like. It was about me finding pleasure in the moment. So I just told him I don't like dresses, which isn't necessarily true. In that moment, it just seemed the simplest. And so he helped me up and strapped me in, and it was a beautiful, pleasurable experience. There was almost no fear involved. As I swung out on the swing, there was a breeze on my face. It was really, really enjoyable. And it brought to my mind this idea of endurance versus pleasure. And the whole rest of my time there, I was weighing things. How much of this is endurance and how much of this is pleasure? And here's the thing. There's always going to be endurance. We have to do things that we don't necessarily want to do, that don't bring us pleasure, in pursuit of pleasure. So the example that came into my mind was having a job. A lot of people love their job, but most of us, there's an aspect to working that is endurance, and depending on your relationship with your specific job. I love my business. I love what I do, but it is tiring. It does take energy, and I have to recharge. If you're working for someone else, sometimes it feels more like endurance than pleasure, because you're showing up, and like we might say something like, oh, I got to get a paycheck, right? I got to pay my bills. I got to pay my rent. I got to pay my mortgage. I got to pay for groceries. I got to pay for my kids. But what we lose sight of sometimes is that is the pleasure. So we do have to endure in order to find pleasure. But what we're looking for is a balance. And sometimes some experiences are all pleasure. And some experiences, there's very little pleasure, and it's almost all endurance. I think, again, I said there was no pleasure in that first experience, and that's not true. There was immense pleasure in being present with those other women in this really beautiful, vulnerable way. And being held, allowing myself to be supported, which is sometimes hard for me. There's pleasure in that. Sometimes we don't see the pleasure in a situation until we go back and look at it. That's why developing a gratitude practice can be really helpful, because you can look at a difficult experience and say, I'm so grateful for Jennifer, who is at this retreat and helped me get my bag back out of the locker and helped me tie my sarong when I was in a full-on panic. I'm so grateful for Liz and Alexa and Trishna, who were in the van waiting for me, who helped take care of me to help me come back and re-regulate myself. I'm so grateful for all the other women who were there, who were helping support me and handing me things and like sending me on my way, and understanding that this is what I needed in that moment. And so that's the other thing I want to say here is the rest of this week, again, for me, became about this idea of endurance versus pleasure. Where am I finding pleasure? If there's a lot of endurance, how much endurance is worth it? If a situation, because everything, Liz at the Femme Genius, who was holding this retreat, did a fabulous job of helping us understand that this was all consent-based. Nothing was required. And so I started looking at all of the things that were coming, all of the other excursions, especially riding in the van. And is this going to be about endurance for me? How much pleasure am I going to get? Where's the balance there? How does it tip? And it's interesting because for me, the healing stuff is almost all pleasure, which sounds a little bit strange to be like, man, if I'm releasing or someone else is crying and I'm holding space for them, to me, that is pleasure. That is actually my comfort zone, because I get so much pleasure out of holding space for myself, for other people, for change, for growth, for spiritual awakening. The endurance for me was more in the actual doing of things. And at one point, one of the women said to me, aren't you going to feel bad that you came all the way to Bali and you only went on this one excursion? And it was beautifully reflected to me the kind of thoughts I used to think about myself. Like, if I wasn't so sensitive, I wouldn't have had issues with the van ride, with the crowd, like all of these things that sort of cascaded into this full-on panic attack. But that's one of the things that I want to say that's really important here, because we talk about it a lot on the show. I am neurodivergent. I am autistic, not officially diagnosed, but absolutely positive that I am. I have ADHD. My brain is wired in a way so that I am very sensitive. And part of trauma healing is taking responsibility for your own regulation, for your own well-being. And in my case, that sometimes requires me to sit things out, to say no to things. In that instance with the water temple, I was so dysregulated, I would not have enjoyed the ritual. I would not probably have been able to regulate myself, and the whole thing would have just felt uncomfortable to me. It would have been all endurance. And in fact, by standing up for what my body, my nervous system was telling me, which was that I was not meant to be there, and getting back out into a different situation, I found my pleasure. I found my regulation. I was able to come back into a state of harmony out of that disharmony. And it took me a while, but what I realized through the rest of this trip was that everyone is unique. And part of trauma healing, again, is knowing yourself, is awareness. Every week, almost, I say, the first step in almost any spiritual practice is awareness. How well do I know myself? How well do I know my needs? I know that I need alone time to recharge, and I took it on this trip. I sat out some of the group activities or the socialization activities, the larger group situations, because that is dysregulating for my nervous system. And I trusted that the other people there would understand that and respect my decision. And I had amazing, pleasurable encounters in smaller groups, one-on-ones especially, groups of 2s and 3s, and in the larger group, of course, in the healing sessions. So much pleasure I was able to find, but I was only able to find the pleasure because I could take care of myself and step out of things that required too much endurance for my nervous system to stand. So my example of that, later in the week, we were scheduled to go on a waterfall hike, and it turned out it was about a 2-hour, I think it ended up for them being about 2.5-hour van ride each way. And then this fairly strenuous hike down to this waterfall and then back up a bunch of stairs. And right away, I knew this is going to be almost all endurance for me. Riding in that van, in that traffic, hiking down in the heat, trying to get back up, it just did not feel like something that would bring me pleasure. And so I decided not to go. And what I ended up doing that day, I was going to go shopping with one of the other women. And this is another thing that's just so amazing. When you're able to claim what you need for yourself, that is this step out of trauma healing into spiritual awakening. Knowing what you need and then having the courage to ask for it, to set the boundaries that you need to take care of yourself, to keep your nervous system regulated so that you can find pleasure, because you can't find pleasure from a dysregulated nervous system. You have to come back into out of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, out of that dysregulated state into that parasympathetic ease, rest and digest mode. That is where we find pleasure. So I had made plans to go shopping with a fellow retreat goer, and I ended up sending her a message in the morning, and I said, I hope this doesn't offend you, but I feel like I need some alone time. I'd love to meet up later. There's another woman who wants to go shopping if you're looking for somebody to go with, because I didn't want to just kind of desert her. But I feel like I need some alone time. I'm going to go down to the beach by myself. And she wrote back and said, actually, I'm really craving some alone time. And it was so beautiful. And if we hadn't been able to be honest with each other about that, both of us might have ended up kind of more in that endurance mode than in pleasure. And that was a completely pleasurable day for me. I walked down to the beach. I sat next to the Indian Ocean. I waded in. The water felt so soft energetically. I am an ocean baby. I'm a water person. I talk about that a lot. So being able to be on the beach in all the way on the other side of the world in a place I'd never been before, had this beautiful, dark, kind of almost black volcanic sand. There was a lot, and there were a lot of people around. There were like kind of restaurant, bar, clubs kind of all along the beach, but they had these beautiful chairs. So I sat down in a chair. I ordered this green tea with lychee. It was so delicious. And I just sat, and it's funny because I brought some things for meditation, and I brought my notebook, and I took some notes. And then all of a sudden I realized I wanted to check in with a friend back home. And the timing is different such that it was like late at night for her, and she's kind of a night owl. And I thought, oh, I bet she's up. And so I ended up having a beautiful conversation with my friend. We were joking that I had to go all the way to Bali in order to have time to talk to her, because she lives here in town, but our schedules are a lot of times just kind of don't line up. And so we've had a hard time connecting. So here I am in this beautiful foreign country, sitting on the beach with my feet in the sand, watching the water, listening to the water, enjoying this delicious beverage, and then having this heart-to-heart share with my friend about kind of the trip and how it had been going and all of that. And then I ended up meeting up with the woman later she had lunch, but for me it was a late lunch, and she came and had a drink. One of the other girls came and had a drink, and so then the three of us had a really nice little time together. And it just felt like this beautiful flow, and it was a beautiful, pleasurable day for me. And it just highlighted this idea of how much of this is endurance, how much of this is survival, how much of this is dysregulation in my nervous system, something I feel like I have to do, and how much of this is ease, how much of this is pleasure, how much of this is joy, how much of this is me being flexible and just allowing the situation to flow. And again, we're always going to have both. We are going to get dysregulated. We are going to get triggered. There are situations that we just have to endure as part of life. But when we can focus on, even in those difficulties, how do I re-regulate myself? Knowing myself well enough, what are the tools I have? For me, alone time, huge. Getting in water. When I would get really overheated, a lot of times I would just jump in the pool and kind of swim or float around. There was also a cold plunge. I did not get all the way in, but it was refreshing. Drinking water, nourishing my body, eating when I'm hungry. We were moving a ton of energy. That requires physical energy to be moved. So when you move a lot of emotional energy, spiritual energy, it requires us to eat, to ground. Eating can help us kind of ground so that all of that energy we're moving gets released. It doesn't kind of get stuck in our system. So this topic falls under trauma healing. It falls under spiritual awakening, because part of trauma healing is learning what can I do to regulate myself and taking responsibility for that. I had this conversation, this came up when I was thinking about today's show a couple of years ago, maybe now, where somebody told me I was playing the victim. That's the wording that they used. And I was thinking about that. That came up today, because there's a point during your trauma healing when you have to decide to stop playing the victim. And I could say, oh my gosh, I'm neurodivergent, I'm motion sick. And I did. I told them what was happening. I don't like crowds. I'm motion sick. I have a phobia of vomiting, whatever it is. And from a non-neurodivergent standpoint, there may, and I don't know that this is true, I'm just saying there are people in my past for sure who have told me repeatedly over and over and over again, you are too sensitive. But I'm not going to play the victim to that. I know how to take care of myself. I'm not going to change the way that I am, and I wouldn't, because my sensitivity is my superpower. My super sensitive hearing allows me to call in and voice frequencies that other people may not be able to access. My super sensitive emotional heart body allows me to hold this vast, amazing space for other people and myself to make change. So I accept my sensitivity, but I also take responsibility to care for myself. That is that idea of I am not playing the victim. I am going to set my boundaries. I am going to stand up for what I need in a situation. And sometimes, quite often for me, that requires me leaving the situation. I left the situation in which somebody told me I was playing the victim because they weren't listening to me. And for me, it was like, you're right, I am playing the victim. And the way that I don't play the victim anymore is to remove myself so that I'm not receiving this energy that is hurting me. When I tell you that it's hurting me and you're not able or willing to change, then I've got to make a decision about how to take care of myself. So a huge part of trauma healing, and I think maybe the transition from trauma healing to spiritual awakening, again, not a linear journey. We go back and forth. There's always going to be aspects of both. But I think one of the huge transitions out of that trauma healing and into spiritual awakening is truly knowing yourself. What do I need in any given situation? And then being able to stand up for that, to voice your needs, to take whatever it is that you need, of course, without ever hurting someone else. But like in my case, it was like me saying, I'm going to head off to bed early. We moved a lot of energy today. I'm feeling really tired. You all enjoy your evening. Or one night I went up to the yoga shala, which was above the common room. I posted a TikTok, and my legs had been so swollen, and I was like, I need to get my legs up the wall, and there was nowhere really to do that. So I went, and there was a kind of a railing, and so I went and I got out a yoga mat and I put my legs up the wall, and I was listening to really soothing music and just breathing, and I could hear my fellow retreat mates down below. They were having such a great time, and they were talking and laughing, and it was like drifting up, and I felt like I was in the energy in a way that felt regulating and soothing and pleasurable to me. If I had been down in the room, it would have been too loud for me, and I probably would have felt overwhelmed and gotten dysregulated. And what ended up happening was, by taking care of myself, by listening to what my body needed and going up to the top there, it was like their energy was sort of raising up, and I could feel it, and I felt like I was part of it, but I was also standing up for what I needed to take care of myself in that moment, so that I could find pleasure, so that I could show up the next day and participate to the full extent that I was able to. And I did that, and I'm very proud of myself for that. And you can do that too. Sometimes that journey from feeling like you're too much or not enough in almost every given situation that comes with that kind of trauma healing, or just being neurodivergent in the world. Sometimes the world feels like too much, or I feel like too much for the world. That can feel really lonely, and it can feel really isolating. And what I discovered on this trip for myself was that when I choose to be alone, because I know that that is what I need to feel good, to feel regulated, to feel pleasure, it becomes solitude rather than isolation. It becomes me taking care of myself. It becomes me setting boundaries about how I care for myself. I heard someone say a while ago that a lot of us think that boundaries are, you put a boundary up and then you want somebody not to cross it. But I'm completely butchering the language here, but I heard somebody talking about how boundaries are really something you set for yourself. What are you willing to tolerate? What do you need in a given moment? And it was so empowering and beautiful throughout this journey for me to recognize, okay, this is more about endurance. How can I switch back into something that feels like pleasure? And then negotiating that for myself. Do I need to completely remove myself from the situation? Do I need to just take a break? Do I need some deep breaths? Maybe I'm dehydrated. I need to drink water. Maybe I'm hungry. I need to eat some food. Negotiating all of those things is how we begin to truly care for ourselves. It's how we step out of that victim role. And we are victimized by so much. I talk about this all the time. Everybody has trauma, developmental trauma growing up, cultural trauma, social trauma. If you're neurodivergent, just being in the world feels traumatic. And people don't understand that. And that's okay. That is part of this taking responsibility for yourself, is letting go of other people's expectations or assumptions about you. And this was a beautiful space that I was in, and I felt very loved and respected by all of the women there. So I'm not talking about that specifically, but just in general, it's really hard to stand up for what you want, to speak up for what you need, and then to sometimes know that the person that you're requesting it from or removing yourself from or whatever it is just doesn't really understand. And letting go of that, not taking things personally, recognizing that you do what you need to do to take care of yourself, it opens the door to so much more pleasure. And life becomes less about that endurance and more about that pleasure. And the balance starts to tip. And pretty soon it becomes more automatic to take care of yourself, to stand up for yourself, to speak your mind in a situation with love and respect for whoever you're speaking to, but in a firm way. This is not for me, thank you. And it's been a long time coming for me, and this trip really helped me embody that. It kind of went from something that I sort of knew in my head and was working on to something that I really feel deep down in my bones at this point. So in today's meditation, we're going to explore this endurance versus pleasure a little bit. And we've done this a few times with little bit different wording, exploring our intuitive yes. We did a show on pleasure. So let's talk just briefly, like, what does this feel like in the body? So what I'm calling endurance, which is also kind of that dysregulation, that fight, flight, freeze, in your body, that feels usually uncomfortable. It feels like a contraction. It feels like muscular tension. It feels like pain. It feels like headache. It feels like a tight jaw. It feels like your pelvic floor being really tight. There's an old phrase called gird your loins. And literally when we are in that sympathetic mode, that dysregulated mode, our pelvic floor tightens up. And then energetically what happens, ironically, what we need is grounding. We need to be connected to the earth. It's one of the reasons I love being on the beach. I feel so connected to the earth there and to the water, which is part of the earth. When we pull up the pelvic floor, we cut off the flow of energy. And what happens to most of us is that we spend chronic time, over time, we're chronically in this tight pelvic floor space, and we completely lose that energetic connection to the ground. And one of the greatest ways to re-regulate, to come out of that fight, flight, or freeze and into the ease or the parasympathetic mode, is to get connected to the earth, is to open that flow of energy so that you are fully embodied. It sounds counterintuitive, especially when you're kind of still really fresh or new to trauma work. I don't want to be in my body. It doesn't feel safe. Trauma healing is about retraining your body to feel safe. So that endurance, when I talk about endurance or dysregulation, I'm going to ask you to figure out what that feels like in your body. And you're looking for things like tension or tightness or discomfort or like, ugh. It's kind of an ugh feeling. In contrast to that, what I'm calling pleasure, which is the parasympathetic or the ease, rest and digest mode, generally that feels like a loosening, like some muscles are relaxing. You might actually find your mind slowing down too. I didn't mention that, but like racing thoughts, that's dysregulation. That's like endurance. What am I going to do? How am I going to, when I was in that temple, how am I going to get out of here? What am I going to do? What's going to happen when we're done? Oh my God, there's so many people in here. Oh my God, they're touching me. It smells so bad. Oh my gosh, I feel sick to my stomach. Blah, 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 blah. So the pleasure mode, that rest and digest mode, the mind slows down. Those thoughts, we don't get rid of thoughts, but they come slower or they feel softer. We don't feel like we need to grab onto them so much. The body feels more expanded. It feels more relaxed. You might remember that you have feet and feel more connected to the earth. So in the meditation, I'm going to talk you through your own personal feeling. What does endurance or dysregulation feel like? What does pleasure or regulation feel like? And you know yourself best. This is part of that step of like knowing myself. What do I feel like when I'm dysregulated? Because I can't re-regulate myself if I don't even know that I'm dysregulated. And when we spend chronic time in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode, in that dysregulation, it starts to feel like our normal. And we don't even know that there's another whole space available to us of this sort of like flowing, kind of pleasurable, expanded, grounded feeling of being in the body and feeling truly relaxed. So we're going to explore that a little bit, and then we'll kind of see. I'm not going to give it all away because I'm going to be in flow. I'm going to be regulated and just see where the meditation takes us. So let's meditate together. So for this meditation, find a comfortable position. You can sit up, you can lie down, whatever's calling to you. If you feel like you might fall asleep, you might at least begin by sitting up. If you do fall asleep, you can always come back and repeat this. Just make sure you're in a safe place to sleep. Don't want to meditate while we're driving. So just begin by doing a little bit of gentle movement with the body, maybe shrugging your shoulders a few times, moving your neck, just to about 30 or 40% of your capacity. We're not stretching here. We're just gently reminding ourselves that we have a body. We spend so much time in the mental space that we forget that we even have a physical body. So you might find I'm just doing a little bit of kind of free-flowing movement, letting my limbs move around a little bit, just gently. Feel whatever part of you is on the ground. If you're sitting with your feet on the floor, move your feet a little bit, just feel into your connection. If you're sitting or lying on the ground, maybe wiggle your body or your bottom a little bit, just to kind of feel that physical sensation of the part of you that's touching the ground. And as you're ready, just come still. You might find a little bit of twitchy movement, as I am, just to kind of shrug off anything that's not serving you. I'm going to do a little arm shake. That's a good way we're just discharging some of the energy of the day or week so that we can come into this fully focused. We're going to take 3 deep oxytocin breaths. We're going to breathe in through the nose, allow the belly to float out strongly. As we breathe out, we're going to use a long ha sound from high to low. So this is one of the greatest tools I know to tell the body to come out of that dysregulated or endurance state and into that regulated or pleasure state. So I'll do one with you, and then I want you to do at least 2 or 3 more. Breathing in through the nose. You might set the intention as you sigh that breath out to bring some pleasure to yourself. Bring that ease or regulated nervous system state. We're setting ourselves up for success here by spending a few moments inviting the body to come out of dysregulation as much as it can in this moment. We're letting go of any judgments about that. Maybe you're still noticing a lot of tension in your body. That's okay. Take a few more of those deep oxytocin breaths as you're called to. And we're going to explore what that feeling of dysregulation or endurance feels like in the body. So allow your awareness to go to any part of your body that feels painful or uncomfortable in this moment. Maybe your shoulders feel tight, maybe your jaw feels clenched. Maybe you notice that your pelvis is actually clenched and tight. Maybe your legs and feet feel uncomfortable. Just noticing any areas of discomfort. That is a signal of dysregulation. And interestingly, we can be simultaneously in both states at once sometimes. We can be mostly regulated with a little bit of dysregulation. We can be mostly dysregulated with a little bit of regulation. We can be all one or the other. It is meant to fluctuate. The system is meant to fluctuate, but we've forgotten how to flow back and forth between states. So right now, notice where you feel uncomfortable. That's the dysregulation. Now find a part of your body that feels okay, even if it's just the tip of your nose, even if you're just looking for not pain. Maybe you're having a really painful day. Find a part of your body that's not in pain, that's not uncomfortable. Maybe it's the edges of your ears. And just notice how that feels. Maybe it just feels neutral, and that's beautiful. Neutral is beautiful. Neutral is our doorway into pleasure. So now coming back to an area that feels contracted or dysregulated, uncomfortable, painful, Place your hand on that part of the body if you can, if it's accessible. If it's not, just set the intention that you're actually touching it. And take 2 or 3 more of those deep oxytocin breaths and just notice what happens. Let go of expectations. We're not asking for anything here. We're just noticing if anything shifts as we breathe deeply. After you've done your 3 breaths, just notice, has anything shifted? Maybe your pain's dropped 1 number on the pain scale. Maybe your discomfort seems a little bit looser. Maybe nothing's changed, and that's completely fine. We're just noticing here. And what we're going to do now is really focus on finding some pleasure. So even when we have pain, we can still find pleasure. So focus on a part of the body that feels neutral, if that was where you arrived before. Maybe it's the tip of your nose. Maybe your thoughts have been slowing down as we're doing this, and you can come into the mental space and notice that it feels a little less intense. From what area you find that feels neutral, again, you can use that oxytocin breath, set the intention of pleasure. Let's look for some pleasure in the body. Take a nice deep oxytocin breath with me. There's pleasure in just releasing your breath. Maybe that's the first time you've taken deep breaths all day. This exercise is the first time you've allowed your breath to deepen. Maybe you find some pleasure in the expansion of your belly as you breathe, or in that whoosh, that ah of air leaving the lungs. See where you can find some pleasure in your body. And again, if neutral is as pleasing as it gets, that's completely fine. Focus on that. But as you focus on that, you might find some expansion so that the neutral begins to come into something that feels good. Maybe you're called to move your body again a little bit. Maybe that feels pleasurable. Some of those tight muscles asking for some gentle movement. Maybe you're called to do a gentle stretch. Just be gentle with anything you do here. And look for the pleasure. We've looked at the discomfort. We've looked at that contraction. See where you can find expansion in your system now. See where you can find some space. See where you can find some settling. Maybe you all of a sudden feel heavier. You're heavier in your seat. You're heavier on the ground. Take a moment to draw attention to whatever part of your body is connected to the earth and invite pleasure into that area. Maybe it's the bottom of your feet. Invite a pleasurable expansion out the bottom of the feet so that that beautiful earth energy can come into your feet, can mingle with your energy. Maybe it's your bottom or your back. Same thing, just invite some expansion, some opening in that area. As you feel heavier, as you feel your body begin to relax, just notice the pleasure in that. Maybe there's just pleasure in not doing for a few moments. Maybe you've been running around accomplishing things all day and you're just taking a few moments out for yourself. A lot of pleasure can be found in that, in this experience of just being with yourself for a moment. Maybe you feel your belly begin to soften. Come back to that oxytocin breath. Come back to those areas of tension or discomfort and breathe directly into them, and then sigh it out with that intention of pleasure in mind. See how much pleasure you can find here. Maybe it's just the barest amount, and that's perfect. Maybe you feel like you're not finding any today, and that's okay. Maybe you feel really calm. Maybe you feel really expanded. Maybe you feel that sense of heaviness, of settling in your limbs, in your bones. Just noticing here, coming back to the oxytocin breath as it serves you. In the last part of this meditation now, I want you to bring your awareness to a situation in your life. Just let it come up intuitively. And I want you to look at this situation with this lens of endurance versus pleasure. What's the balance here? Is this all endurance? Where can you find some pleasure, even if it feels like mostly endurance? We're not necessarily asking to shift this situation, although you may get some clarity about a decision that you've been thinking about. We're just looking at this situation. And give yourself a number here, a percentage. What percentage of this situation in your life is endurance and what percentage is pleasure? And maybe you're thinking about something that brings you so much pleasure and joy. Maybe you're focused on something that feels a little bit more like that endurance. You can always come back and repeat this. Just noticing what's the number that's coming out. And if you get a high number for your endurance, just ask yourself gently, without judgment, can I find more pleasure in this situation? What might that look like? I found this beautiful expansion in my body just now. How can I find that in this situation, in this relationship, whatever it is that you're focused on? And if you can't find pleasure, maybe you focus on that neutrality. Where can I come out of endurance and into that more lovingly detached state of neutrality? And from that state of neutrality, we can find pleasure. Letting go of that now, knowing that you can come back to it. See how much pleasure you can find in your body in the next few moments. I'm assisting you with Reiki through this transmission. We're going to step into a short sound journey. Breathe into any areas of discomfort. Sigh that discomfort out of your body. Let go of endurance as much as you can in this moment of that dysregulation. Find this sense of expansion, this sense of ease, this sense of pleasure as much as you can for the next few moments. Hey, Anaya, say, hey, Anaya, say, hey, Anaya, say, nai, hey, Aya, say, hey, Aya, say, nai, Seanai, Seanai, Sei, Sei, last few moments here, releasing even that pursuit of pleasure. Just being where you are in this moment, fully accepting all aspects of yourself, the tension, the pain, the discomfort, the ease, the grace, the expansion. All of it exists within you at any given time. So focusing more on finding that neutrality, finding that pleasure, will begin to train your nervous system to come into that state of ease, into that regulated parasympathetic space. You deserve to have pleasure. And if you're able, repeat after me out loud, or just think this silently to yourself. I deserve pleasure in all aspects of my being. Pleasure is my birthright, and I deserve it. I deserve to find joy in the things that I do. I call pleasure into my life now, and I receive it. Taking one or two more deep breaths, sighing them out with that audible, pleasurable ha sound. If you're in a safe space and you like to drift off to sleep, you can allow yourself to do that. If you're coming back to the rest of your day or evening, begin to slowly move your body. Take some deep breaths. Be slow here. Be easy as you come out of this practice of bringing yourself pleasure, of bringing yourself regulation and ease. You richly deserve this. Sat Nam. The truth of your identity is multifaceted. Know that you can hold endurance and pleasure together in your vessel. Know that you can focus on pleasure and train yourself to feel that pleasure deeply. Know that you deserve this. As you're ready, take one or two more deep breaths. Maybe shrug your shoulders a few times, circle your wrists and ankles, just coming back slowly to yourself here. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I urge you as you go forward into the rest of this day, into the rest of your week, look for those moments of pleasure. Focus on them. Connect with your body to find that ease, to find that pleasure. And know that as you do this, you call more pleasure to you. You retrain your system to find ease, to find pleasure. Have a pleasurable rest of your day or evening. I will see you next week for Wind Down Wednesdays. No.